Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Warm Tales. I'm Harry, and I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. How is your day going? And wherever you're watching or listening from, do let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoy these quiet mysteries, please do subscribe. It means the world. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin. Chapter 1. A Morning in Steepleworthy. The village of Steepleworthy arranged itself along the foot of a low chalk hill in the manner of a village that had been doing exactly this for 600 years and saw no particular reason to change. It was late August, which in that part of England meant the blackberries were just darkening at the field margins. The swallows were assembling in long, anxious rows along the telegraph wires, as though rehearsing for a departure none of them could quite bring themselves to make, and the air held the peculiar quality of summer's last effort. Warm still, sweetly warm, but with an undertow of cool that arrived each evening promptly at 6:30 and made itself felt first in the ankles and the back of the neck before spreading to the whole of one's person. The annual village fair was 4 days hence. This fact was felt throughout Steepleworthy the way a coming storm is felt. Not yet arrived, but present in the slight speeding of movement, the small brightening of expression, the conversations conducted at shop doorways, where there had been no conversations the previous week. Mrs. Hopwood at the bakery had placed a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising 6 for 4 on her shortbread rounds. The vicar's wife, a brisk woman named Mrs. Partridge, had already positioned 3 trestle tables in the church hall and stood regarding them with the expression of a general considering her field of battle. The Women's Institute banner, ivory linen with the words Steepleworthy W.I. executed in a deep plum embroidery that had taken 3 of the members the better part of 2 winters, had been aired and pressed and now lay folded on the bench inside the porch. It was a Friday morning, market day, and the high street was doing its best impression of genuine commerce. Mr. Dibley, whose grocery occupied the most advantageous corner of the village center, had arranged a pyramid of early autumn apples in his window. Cox's orange pippins, small and blushed, still holding a faint warmth from whatever sun had reached them. He was a heavy-set man of 60, placid in manner and exact in the matter of weights, and he nodded to his customers with the same unhurried courtesy he had offered for 37 years. Beside him, sharing the corner in a more modest fashion, was the stationer's, run by young Mr. Aldous Farrant, who had returned to the village 3 years ago after some years in Ipswich, where he had acquired a manner slightly more metropolitan than the village found entirely comfortable. He sold greeting cards, writing paper, and a small selection of gifts in the front room, and conducted a modest business repairing clocks in the back. He had, until this Friday morning, been one of the more reliable presences on the high street. Open at 8, closed for lunch from 1 to 2, closed at 5:30. His shop was not open. This was noted by Mrs. Treadwell, who wanted stamps and a birthday card for her sister in Colchester, as she arrived at 9 and found the door locked, the blinds still drawn. She remarked upon it to Mr. Dibley, who was arranging a second tier of apples with the concentration of a man stacking ordnance. "He'll have overslept," said Mr. Dibley, which was the first explanation anyone reached for in a village where unexplained closures were rare and required accounting. But by 9:30, when Mrs. Hargreaves, who delivered the post, and who was therefore the person in Steepleworthy most likely to know the current circumstances of each resident, reported that there had been no response at Mr. Farrant's flat above the shop, and that she had knocked twice, being rather firm about it, as she had a parcel that would not fit through the box. The village's interpretation shifted slightly from oversight to concern. Word travels in a village with remarkable efficiency. By 10 o'clock, Mrs. Boscombe at the lending library had heard it from the pharmacist's assistant. By 1:15, the postmistress, Mrs. Ingle, had telephoned the vicar's wife, who had telephoned 3 others. And by 1:30, the general consensus along the high street was that Aldous Farrant had, for some reason that was not yet clear, but that several people were already speculating about quite freely, disappeared. It was into this atmosphere of low, pleasant agitation that Miss Jane Marple arrived at 20 minutes to 11, wearing her gray wool coat. Not yet the autumn one, which was heavier and had been retrieved from the cedar chest only 2 days ago, but the transitional coat that served perfectly well until the first frost, and carrying her wicker basket, which contained a library book to be returned, a prescription to be collected, and a mental note about butter. She stopped first at the library, where Mrs. Boscombe, a narrow-faced woman of considerable intelligence, somewhat underemployed by her position, was glad to have an audience who might appreciate nuance. "He was perfectly ordinary on Wednesday," said Mrs. Boscombe, accepting the returned novel with one hand while gesturing with the other in the direction of the stationers. "He came in for the Radio Times and asked about a biography of Capability Brown they'd had delivered. I remember because we had a brief conversation about the ha-ha. The landscape feature, you understand, not the laughter." "A ha-ha," said Miss Marple, with quiet interest. "Rather an unusual topic." He was an unusual young man, in certain ways. Knowledgeable about a surprising range of things. He seemed quite himself on Wednesday. Mrs. Boscombe paused. "He did mention, now I think of it, that he expected to be rather busy through the fair weekend. He'd taken on a stall, you know. The fair committee asked him. Clocks and curios, I think." Miss Marple said that sounded most sensible, and had Mrs. Boscombe anything she would recommend in the way of lighter reading this week, something that did not require following a great many characters through a very large number of rooms. Mrs. Boscombe, slightly amused, reached for a volume she'd been saving without consciously saving it. At the chemist's, collecting her prescription, Miss Marple listened to the young woman behind the counter, a pleasant girl called Sandra Peel, who had a sister who worked next door to the stationers of the haberdashers, describe how the haberdasher had not, in fact, heard anything unusual from the flat above the stationers the previous evening, though she had been working late on a hem, and would have heard, she thought, if there had been any commotion. The flat had been quiet, but Mr. Farron's car was gone. "Is it?" said Miss Marple. She counted out the correct change for her prescription with perfect attention. "The green one? He does drive rather briskly along the Mill Lane end, doesn't he?" "He does," agreed Sandra Peel, and added that she hoped he was all right because he'd been very kind when her mother had been taken poorly and had wound all their clocks for free. Miss Marple said that was the sort of thing one remembered about a person, wasn't it, and walked home. Chapter 2. The Fair Committee and Other Anxieties. The Saturday before the fair proper, Steepleworthy's annual committee, comprised of the vicar, his wife, 2 Women's Institute representatives, Mr. Dibley, and a rotating 4th member who was this year the landlord of the King's Arms, a cheerful man named Patrick Sefton, met in the church hall at 10 in the morning to conduct their final arrangements. It was the kind of meeting that always ran 40 minutes longer than anyone expected, not because of complexity, but because of the natural reluctance of village committees to reach any conclusion without having first considered the matter from every possible angle, including angles that could not, by any reasonable assessment, be considered. The matter of Aldous Farrant's stall was, this morning, an additional item on the agenda, carried over from the previous week. His name was on the printed program, his table reserved in the east corner of the fair field, and he had, 3 weeks prior, paid his stall fee in full. The question before the committee was whether his space should be reallocated or held. "He'll turn up," said the landlord, Mr. Sefton, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had seen a great many temporary disappearances conclude without incident. "Young men do this sort of thing. He'll have had a reason, and he'll explain it when he comes back." Mrs. Partridge, the vicar's wife, was less comfortable about this. She had, it emerged, spoken to Constable Marsh that morning, who had looked in on the shop and confirmed that the flat was empty, beds slept in, dishes in the drainer, a quantity of milk in the refrigerator that had not yet spoiled, suggesting an absence of 2 days at most. Mr. Farrant had, to all appearances, left in an ordinary way. Nothing was disturbed. He had taken a jacket, his wallet by the look of the empty hook in the hall, and his car. If he left voluntarily, said Mrs. Partridge, then the question becomes, why would he leave 4 days before the fare for which he'd paid and prepared? This question descended over the committee table with the weight of a question that had no comfortable answer. Mr. Dibley mentioned that Farrant had ordered a fresh delivery of tissue paper and display stands, which had arrived on Tuesday. The vicar pointed out that a man who had ordered display stands was unlikely to abandon a fare he'd specifically prepared for. Unless something changed, said Mrs. Ingle, who had been on the committee long enough to say plainly what others were navigating around. Between Tuesday and Thursday evening, Constable Marsh, when Mrs. Partridge had telephoned him, had apparently said that without evidence of anything having gone wrong, there was little he could formally do beyond making an inquiry. Mr. Farrant was an adult. He had left without visible sign of distress or struggle. He was not, technically, missing under any definition that required immediate official concern. This was unsatisfying but legally accurate. On Sunday morning, Miss Marple attended the 8 o'clock service. She preferred the early one, which was shorter and attracted a congregation who were there primarily to worship rather than to observe one another, and spoke briefly afterward with the vicar, a gentleman called Reverend Gallo who had come to the village only 4 years ago and still sometimes had the look of a man learning the grammar of a very old language. "The fair committee are troubled," said Reverend Gallo, gathering his surplice against the morning air. "Naturally," said Miss Marple. "It is a week's worth of preparations." "It isn't only that," he said, and glanced toward the high street, which was quiet still, the shutters up, the early light falling in long yellow panels on the pavement. Farrant was quite well integrated, for someone who'd only been here 3 years. People had taken to him. Mrs. Boscombe, old Mr. Dean who has the clocks, 1 or 2 of the younger women. He paused, then added with careful neutrality. He was quite friendly with Patricia Thorne over at Larchwood Farm, though I shouldn't say that as though it were relevant. "No," agreed Miss Marple, placidly. She adjusted the clasp on her coat. "How are the dahlias this year, Reverend? I notice yours have come on splendidly. That deep orange one near the lich gate." "Coral," he said, momentarily brightened. "The coral has been exceptional this year." Miss Marple said she had thought as much, wished him a good morning, and walked home past the high street, which was beginning to stir, the first delivery lorry of the week making its deliberate way between the narrow buildings, and the bakery's window exhaling its first warm breath of the day across the pavement. She walked slowly, as was her habit, not from infirmity, but from long practice in letting things arrive at their proper pace. The mention of Patricia Thorne over at Larchwood Farm had arrived and settled somewhere in the back of her mind like a small stone finding the bottom of a deep, clear pool. Chapter 3. The Wednesday Market and its Observations. The Wednesday Market in Steepleworthy took place in the small square behind the church, which was given over for the morning to a collection of stalls that varied very little from week to week, which was exactly as the regulars preferred. There was the egg woman from Chandler's Cross, a florist from Lower Steeple who always brought lavender bundles tied with brown twine, a man who sold honey and beeswax candles, a small produce stall that was actually an extension of Mr. Dibley's but was technically operated by his nephew, and at the back of the square where the old mounting block stood, a second-hand bookstall presided over by a woman named Dorothea Crane, whose mental catalog of her own inventory was so complete and precise that she could locate any book within 40 seconds without consulting a list. Miss Marple arrived at 9:20, when the market was fully established but not yet crowded. She moved at the pace of someone who had nowhere in particular to be, which in her case was the pace of someone who had every intention of seeing everything. She spent a deliberate time at the produce stall examining a crate of marrow squash and speaking to Mr. Dibley's nephew, a thin young man of 19 who had his uncle's placid quality but not yet his precision. He had heard, as everyone had, about Mr. Farrant, and, like many people of 19 confronted with an ambiguous event, had defaulted to the most dramatic available interpretation, which was that Farrant had gone off with a woman and would return either triumphant or ruined. "That seems rather a large conclusion from rather small evidence," said Miss Marple, considering the squash. "Well, there was someone, wasn't there?" said the nephew. "Everyone knows. Patricia Thorne. At Larchwood Farm?" Miss Marple turned the squash over in her hands. "She came into the shops sometimes. More than you'd expect for a stationer's, like. And he went out to the farm, too. Mr. Sefton at the King's Arms mentioned seeing his car along the Larkswood Road 2 or 3 times of a Monday evening, which isn't anything, is it, except, well, he seemed to feel he had gone further than intended. I suppose it's only gossip." "Most things are, to begin with," said Miss Marple pleasantly. She bought 2 of the marrows and tucked them into her basket and moved on to the honey stall. She did not seek out further conversation about Patricia Thorne or about Aldous Farrant. She bought lavender from the florist and spent a satisfying 10 minutes with Dorothea Crane discussing the relative merits of 2 editions of a book on English garden history, and made her way to the chemist's on her way home, where she was collecting a pot of cold cream that had been ordered in specially. Sandra Peel was not in today, a Tuesday and Thursday girl, it transpired. But the pharmacist himself, a tall, quiet man named Mr. Hollis, served Miss Marple with the efficiency of a man who conducts most of his professional interactions with great competence and very little conversation. He did, however, mention that Patricia Thorne had been in the previous day for something for a headache, the bad kind, migraine. I think she was quite pale, and that she had asked in the course of the transaction whether anyone had had news of Aldous Farrant. "Asking directly," said Miss Marple, with the tone of someone confirming a recipe quantity. "Directly enough," said Mr. Hollis. "Unusual. Most people circle around a question like that. She just asked." Miss Marple found this interesting in the particular way she found things interesting, not with any outward sign of it, but with a kind of quiet attention that was itself a form of thinking. She thanked Mr. Hollis, declined to carry her bag in favor of her basket, and walked home through the lane that passed the back of the stationer's shop, where the alley alongside it was narrow and shaded, and where Aldous Farrant's display stands could still be seen, just visible through the small rear window, wrapped in their brown paper and leaning neatly against the wall. That evening she sat by the open window with a cup of tea that grew gradually cold as the swallows made their last circuits above the lane and the light drew back from the garden in the unhurried way of August evenings. The information of the day arranged itself without her directing it. Patricia Thorne. A car on the Larchwood Road. Display stands purchased and never unwrapped. A question asked directly rather than circled around. There was a specific quality to directness in Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature that was worth attending to. It was not the same as honesty. Directness, under certain kinds of pressure, could be as carefully managed as any other performance. Chapter 4. A Thursday Afternoon Caller. Constance Bellamy arrived at Miss Marple's cottage at 3 on Thursday afternoon, as she had arrived at 3 on various Thursdays over the previous 15 years, which was the length of their friendship, which had begun at a garden fete in a village 12 miles distant, where both had admired the same climbing hydrangea and fallen into conversation with the naturalness of 2 people who immediately and without ceremony understood one another. Constance Bellamy was 71, which was 2 years older than Miss Marple, and possessed of a memory of such formidable capacity and exactitude that several people in the district had, over the years, tried to persuade her into various administrative positions which she had declined with great courtesy and equal firmness. as she had found that official positions imposed a restriction on what one was permitted to remember, and she preferred to remember everything. She sat now in the armchair by the window with her tea and her first of 2 biscuits and described, with the particular pleasure of a person who has been waiting to discuss something properly, the events of Tuesday, when she had driven past Larchwood Farm on her way to visit her sister and had, on impulse, stopped to speak with Patricia Thorne, whom she knew slightly and had always liked. "She's 26, said Constance. Or 27. Dark hair, broad shoulders, very competent looking. Runs the farm largely herself, now, since her father's health became uncertain. She was in the yard when I stopped, doing something with a fence post. She was glad to stop, I think." "How did she seem?" asked Miss Marple. "Strained," said Constance Bellamy, who made no distinction between the ordinary and the precise answer. "Not merely anxious. There's a difference. Anxious is when you don't know an outcome and you're waiting. Strained is when you know something and you've been carrying it for some time. She had the look of a woman who had not slept properly for several days. But she spoke quite sensibly about the farm, her barley yield, the cost of feed. She asked after my sister. Did she mention Mr. Farrant? She did not, though I am quite certain she wanted to." Constance considered her second biscuit. "I mentioned him, eventually, in the way one does, expressing the general hope that the confusion would be cleared up before the fair. She said she was sure it would." A pause. "She said it the way one says a thing one is not sure of at all, but has decided to commit to." Miss Marple received this quietly. She poured more tea for them both, and they spent some minutes discussing Constance's sister, who had recently had a pergola built and was divided on the question of whether wisteria or climbing roses would be more suitable, a question on which both Miss Marple and Constance had views they were prepared to defend. Before Constance left, pulling on her driving gloves in the narrow hall, she said, with the air of someone offering a small additional item, that she had noticed on her way out of Larkswood's yard a vehicle parked on the grass verge some distance along the lane. Not Mr. Farrant's green car, something darker and older make. She had not paid it particular attention at the time. She mentioned it now because she had the feeling she ought to mention it, though she could not have explained precisely why. "A dark car on a lane verge," said Miss Marple, holding the cottage door open against a small investigating breeze. "An older dark car," said Constance Bellamy, "which is not the sort of thing one usually finds parked on a lane verge, is it? Lanes attract walkers who park and walk on. But walkers park in passing places or gateways, generally. The verge would leave them rather exposed to the hedgerow." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think you were quite right to mention it." That evening, knitting for a time before the light failed, a charity square for the W.I. jumble in a soft blue wool, Miss Marple found her mind returning to something she could not quite place yet, a feeling less than a thought, more than nothing. The kind of feeling she had learned, over many years, to treat with more respect than most people would think quite sensible. Chapter 5. Friday and the Question of the Apples. On Friday, the day before the fair, the village was busy in a pleasant, sustained way, the kind of busyness that contains within it the excitement of preparation and has not yet tipped into the anxiety of the actual event. The fair field, behind the village hall, sloping gently down to the row of old horse chestnuts that bounded the property on the east, was being laid out. Mr. Sefton from the King's Arms and 2 of his regular patrons had erected the main marquee in the morning. The W.I. had established their cake and jam stall. The vicar's wife was directing the installation of the plant table, and the children's games area was being measured and marked with flower line, which the wind was gently disturbing. There was still no word of Aldous Farrant. Constable Marsh had filed a formal missing persons report on Thursday, prompted partly by Mrs. Partridge's insistence, and partly by his own quiet sense that 4 days without contact was 4 days too many for a man with a stall booked and a rent due and standing orders at the bank. The report had gone in. The appropriate wheels were turning at the appropriate pace, and the village had settled into the particular holding pattern of a community that is concerned but has exhausted its immediate capacity to act. Miss Marple went to Mr. Dibley's on Friday morning for butter and the cooking apples she had been meaning to get all week. She was making chutney on Saturday, not the day of the fair. She would attend the fair in the afternoon, but she could put the chutney on in the morning and let it manage itself. She asked for Cox's, and Mr. Dibley, with the authority of a man who had handled 37 years' worth of Cox's, shook his head slightly and said the Bramleys were better this year. He had had them in from a farm out toward Thetbury. Exceptional, very clean acid. The Thetbury farms are excellent for Bramleys, Miss Marple agreed. Are those from Larkswood? No, said Mr. Dibley. Larkswood is barley, mainly, and some soft fruit. Patricia Thorne brings me strawberries in June, which are first-rate. He paused, weighing the apples with the quiet attention he gave to everything. She came in yesterday. Actually, I thought she looked thin and tired, which isn't like her. She's a healthy young woman generally. She bought very little, milk and 1 tin of soup. He added this final detail with the delicacy of a man who felt it told a story but didn't want to be the one to tell it. 1 tin of soup, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, and said no more about it. She walked home carrying her Bramleys, which were indeed excellent. Firm and sharp in that particular way that meant they would hold their shape through cooking and give the chutney a proper base. The High Street was beginning its final preparations. A bunting line had been strung from the post office to the chemist's, and a second from the chemist's to the corner of Farrant Stationers, where it anchored itself on a nail that Mr. Farrant had presumably placed himself at some previous fair. The blind in his window was still drawn. Miss Marple paused at the corner, apparently examining the bunting or possibly the display of shortbread in the bakery window beyond it. She stood there for a moment in the way she stood, not still exactly because she breathed and occasionally adjusted the basket, but in the way of someone whose attention has gone inward and who is in that state of apparently complete vacancy that means, in fact, the opposite. The dark car on the verge. The 1 tin of soup. Patricia Thorne asking directly rather than circling. Aldous Farrant ordering display, stands on a Tuesday, unlocking a shop on a Wednesday, and then quietly, completely, without apparent disturbance, not being there on Thursday. It reminded her, with some force, of a woman she had known once, a Mrs. Clement Harwick, who had vanished with complete competence from a situation that had become, for reasons only she fully understood, impossible. She had not run. She had not fled. She had simply ceased, with great care and apparent forethought, to be in the place where the difficulty was. Mrs. Clement Harwick had been, in Miss Marple's recollection, a woman of considerable practical intelligence who had been underestimated by everyone who knew her. The person who had underestimated her most, and had paid the most consequential price for doing so, had been a man who thought he knew exactly what she would do. Miss Marple moved on. She had butter to put in the refrigerator before it softened. Chapter 6. The Fair Day and the Found Paper. The village fair opened at noon on Saturday under a sky of that particularly gracious sort, not brilliantly sunny, which would have been too hot for comfort, but a warm white overcast through which the light came evenly and gently, flattering the bunting and the flowers and the long tables of jams and the expressions of people who were glad to be out and together and had not had to fight the sun to do it. Miss Marple arrived at 2 o'clock, when the initial rush had settled and the event had found its pace. She toured the plant table and purchased 3 pots of alpine strawberry, because she had been meaning to establish a border of them for 2 years. She admired the W.I. cake stall and declined the Victoria sponge only because she had a raspberry jam at home that needed using. She watched the children's sack race with a mild appreciation of someone who finds the falls more charming than the winning, and accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Partridge with the gratitude of a woman who had walked further than she'd intended. Aldous Farrant's stall in the east corner of the field was occupied, not by Farrant, who was still absent, but by a young man from the fair committee who had volunteered to operate it, displaying a collection of the clocks and small antique items that Ferrand had, apparently, prepared and left behind in his shop. The fair committee had decided, after some deliberation, that it was more respectful to his preparations than to leave the space empty. Constable Marsh had been consulted and had not objected. Miss Marple paused at this stall for some time, examining a small carriage clock with the attention of someone who knows something about clocks. The young committee volunteer, eager to be useful, talked a little about the pieces, where they'd been found in the shop, how they'd been arranged, whether Miss Marple thought the price on the carriage clock was reasonable. "It's rather underpriced." "Actually," said Miss Marple, "the movement is a Jaeger. They hold their value." She set it down and looked at a small wooden box to the left of it, a pine box about the size of a hardback book, painted blue and fitted with a simple latch. "Was this from the shop as well?" "From under the counter, I think," said the young man. "Sergeant Holt had a look at everything before we brought it out. He said it was all right to display." Miss Marple did not open the box. She looked at it for a moment with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that could not yet be explained, and then asked the young man whether the shortbread from Mrs. Hopwood's stall was the almond kind or the plain, because she had a preference. It was Sergeant Holt himself who, by chance, or something resembling it, came to stand near the stall some 20 minutes later, checking through the field in a leisurely way with his hands behind his back and the benign expression of a large man who is professionally calm. He had been steeple-worthy sergeant for 11 years and had developed, over those 11 years, a settled respect for the village's rhythms and an equally settled respect for a small number of the village's residents whose understanding of those rhythms he had reason to consider rather more acute than his own. "Lovely afternoon," said Miss Marple, who had not moved far from the stall. "Very pleasant," agreed Sergeant Holt. "That little blue box," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone mentioning something that had come to mind without particular relevance. "You had a look through it earlier." "I did. Papers and what have you. An old letter, receipts, nothing significant." "Receipts," said Miss Marple. She seemed to reflect on something quite different. "It is curious, isn't it, how much can be in a receipt? One thinks of them as the most ordinary of things, but they record what was purchased and when, and sometimes also, if the vendor is thorough, by whom." Sergeant Holt's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted by a very small degree, the degree by which a large and professionally calm man indicates that he has understood more than was explicitly said. He glanced at the blue box. Then he looked back at Miss Marple, who was examining the alpine strawberries she'd purchased and adjusting the wrapping. "I don't suppose," she added, in the tone of someone remembering something mildly amusing, "that any of them were for fuel. Only I notice Ferrand's car is gone, and one always wonders about range, whether a person has thought through quite how far they intended to go." "A receipt for petrol," said Sergeant Holt. "Several receipts," said Miss Marple, in the vague way that meant she had already counted them. "Purchased at intervals, over a number of months." She smiled pleasantly at him. "Now, have you tried the honey from the middle stall? I thought it quite remarkable, slightly floral. I think the hives must be near the old orchard along the Thetbury Road." Sergeant Holt, with the expression of a man who has just seen something he should have seen 3 days ago, moved toward the stall again, this time with rather more purpose. Chapter 7. The Letter in the Box. The blue box was taken by Sergeant Holt that afternoon, after the fair had closed and the field was being cleared of its good-natured litter. Paper cups, the occasional fallen bunting end, a child's lost cardigan. He examined its contents at the station with Constable Marsh, who had come in on his half-day off for the purpose because he was, despite his official position of mild concern, genuinely troubled in the way that a good constable is troubled by things that do not resolve themselves neatly. The receipts were what Miss Marple had suggested they would be. There were 11 of them, all petrol, purchased at stations on a route that began in Steepleworthy and proceeded, at various intervals over the previous 8 months, through a sequence of towns that form a rough line toward the east coast. The distances were consistent, a tank's worth of petrol taking a particular car on a predictable range. They had been kept in careful order, clipped together with a paper clip that had left a slight rust mark on the topmost one. Underneath them was a letter. The letter was handwritten, in a script that was small and precise and entirely illegible to Constable Marsh, who had always been unable to read handwriting that was smaller than a certain point size. Sergeant Holt, who had grown up with a grandmother of the old school, had no such difficulty. He read it twice in silence, then put it down on the table with the particular care of someone placing something that requires careful handling. "It's from Ferrant," he said, "or addressed to Ferrant." From someone named, he looked again, R. Constable Marsh, who could not read the letter but could read Sergeant Holt's expression, sat forward. The letter, as Sergeant Holt summarized it for the constable's notebook, was several months old and contained a warning of some specificity. The writer, R., had become aware that Ferrant was being watched, not by the police, by someone who had an interest in what Ferrant knew. The writer described a particular concern about a set of documents, the exact nature of which was referred to only obliquely, in terms suggesting the writer assumed the reader would understand without being told, and advised in clear terms that these documents should not remain where they were. There was a reference to an agreement, and to the terms of the agreement being violated, and to there being consequences for violation that would not be abstract. The letter ended, "I am not, you understand, being dramatic. This is the single useful thing I can tell you. They do not make idle threats, and they do not forget. Please be sensible. There is no last name for R. There was no address. There was a postscript in a slightly different ink, as though added later. The farm is perhaps not as safe as it seems to you at present." Sergeant Holt placed the letter back in the blue box with the receipts. He and Constable Marsh sat in the station for a moment without speaking, in the way of two people who had been given, quite suddenly, rather more to think about than they had brought their dinner hour to accommodate. It was Constable Marsh who said, after a time, that he wondered what Miss Marple had made of all that. Sergeant Holt gave him a look that suggested this was not necessarily the direction they ought to be following in an official capacity, but which also conceded that it was a reasonable question. What Miss Marple had made of the letter, in fact, was a great deal, but all of it at some distance from the station, in the quieter arena of her own mind, where things were permitted to arrange themselves without interruption or the complication of needing to be presented to anyone else. Chapter 8. The Marmalade. On Sunday morning, Miss Marple made marmalade. She had been doing this for a very long time, 40 years at the least, possibly rather more, and the making of marmalade was, for her, one of those tasks that occupied the hands so completely and so pleasantly that the mind was free to do as it liked, which was to say, free to do precisely what it needed to do. She had Seville oranges from the previous season, bought when they were available in January, and kept in their preserving jars, and she brought the first jar out in the morning and set herself to work at the large kitchen table, with the copper pan and the wooden spoon and the linen cloth and the small sharp knife that had been her aunt's. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was in its late August state of pleasant dishevelment. The roses well past their second flush and beginning to retreat, the lavender silver and spent, the great clump of Michaelmas daisies along the south wall still some weeks from opening, holding their promise. A robin was working along the base of the wall with the absolute dedicated focus of a small creature who has decided this particular stretch of earth is his business. She began to work, and as she worked, without directing it, the things she needed to understand began to come clear. There was the letter, a warning sent months ago from someone who knew, the suggestion that certain documents needed moving, and the implication that they had been somewhere discoverable, somewhere that had seemed safe and was no longer. The farm, said the postscript, is perhaps not as safe as it seems to you at present. Patricia Thorne's farm. And so Patricia Thorne was not merely a person Aldous Ferrant had driven to see on Monday evenings. She was part of the context. She had been storing something, or Ferrant had been storing something in her keeping, or the understanding between them had been shaped by something considerably more serious than affection. However, much affection may also have been present. And then Ferrant had gone, quietly, with his wallet and his jacket and his car, taking the car in a particular direction, as the receipt suggested, the route toward the East Coast, or at any rate, making a pattern of moving in that direction over time, perhaps establishing a path, a familiarity, so that when the time came the movement would feel, to any observer, like a familiar errand. She did not think he had been harmed. That was the first thing, and it settled in her with the particular quality of a conclusion that has been tested quietly and holds. A man who feared harm, and who was practically intelligent. Dorothea Crane had given him capability Brown, not because he asked for it, but because she recognized the shape of his interests, would not wait to be harmed. He would move before the moment of danger arrived. He would be sensible, as the letter instructed him to be. The documents, then. The letter spoke of documents that should not remain where they were. If Ferrant had taken the documents when he left, there was nothing in the shop to find. The box had contained only the receipts, the route, already used or soon to be, and the letter itself, left behind as cleanly as a man leaves something he no longer needs. But someone had still been watching. The dark car on the verge of the Larkswood Lane, parked where a walker would not park, and where someone watching the farm would park if they were not especially concerned about being noticed, or if they were confident that no one who noticed them would understand what they were seeing, which meant Patricia Thorne was still in the position the letter had named. The farm is perhaps not as safe as it seems to you at present. The marmalade reached its setting point. She could tell by the way it sheeted off the spoon, a thing she had never needed a thermometer for, and she moved it from the heat with the competent authority of a woman who has been managing boiling sugar for 4 decades, and began to pour it into the warm jars in a steady amber stream. She thought about the woman who had asked directly rather than circling, about the 1 tin of soup, about someone who was buying very little and eating very little and sleeping very little, not because she was ordinarily anxious, but because she was carrying something that she had been carrying for long enough that it had grown heavier than she admitted or than anyone around her had seen clearly enough to name. Miss Marple sealed the last jar. She washed the copper pan. She stood for a moment at the kitchen window watching the robin, who had found something excellent and was now attending to it with complete satisfaction. She would go to the station in the morning, not with any drama. She had a small observation to offer, and she was not certain it would be useful, and she would accept tea. Chapter 9. A Call at the Station. The village police station stood at the quiet end of the high street, behind a low privet hedge that Constable Marsh kept trimmed on the basis that a tidy hedge was a statement of civic intention. It was a modest building, 2 rooms downstairs, 1 room up, a small yard at the back where the constable sometimes ate his sandwiches when the weather permitted, and it had the settled, slightly worn atmosphere of a place where people came with their difficulties and were heard with patience, if not always with resolution. Miss Marple arrived at 10 on Monday morning, which was just after Sergeant Holt had settled with his second cup of tea and just before the day's inevitable interruptions commenced. She wore the gray wool coat, which was entirely appropriate for the morning, and carried her wicker basket, which contained a jar of the previous day's marmalade, which she presented to Sergeant Holt with the mild observation that it was a good year for the Sevilles. Sergeant Holt received this with every appearance of genuine pleasure and made her tea. She sat in the chair on the near side of the desk, which was a slightly lower chair than the one behind the desk, a fact that gave Sergeant Holt a professional height advantage that she had always thought he deserved to have, since he used it so judiciously. "I don't know that this will be much use," she began, in the tone of someone who has considered whether to speak and decided modestly in favor, "but I found myself thinking about Mr. Ferrant." Constable Marsh, who had been reading something in the far corner, opened his notebook. He was a careful sort of young man, wasn't he? She continued. "I gather from Mrs. Boscombe that he read widely. History, landscape architecture, practical subjects. One gets a picture from the things a person chooses to read of the kind of mind they have. It seems to have been a mind that liked to understand how things were arranged. A small pause. How they were built. How they might also be dismantled, I suppose, when that became necessary. Sergeant Holt had set down his cup. "The receipts in the box," said Miss Marple. "I noticed there were 11 of them, which is a rather precise and regular number for what one might call practice routes. And the blue box itself, it was under the counter in the shop. Not his storeroom, not his flat above, the shop counter, where anyone might place a box in the ordinary course of a business day. Not hidden, simply positioned where it would eventually be found by someone who had reason to look without being in any way conspicuous to someone who was not looking for it. He left it to be found," said Sergeant Holt quietly. "I rather think so, or left it in the event that it needed to be found." Miss Marple turned her cup in its saucer, which suggests he understood that there was a possibility things might not conclude as quietly as he hoped, and that if they did not, it would help someone to have a route to follow. She paused. The letter, too. He kept it for some months. One only keeps a letter that one thinks one may need someone else to read. Constable Marsh's pen had been moving for some time. "Now," said Miss Marple, and this was the moment. The word "now" was the hinge, and anyone watching carefully would have seen Sergeant Holt recognize it. "There is a matter that is perhaps more pressing than Mr. Farrant's own situation, which I suspect is rather better than it appears." She set her cup down. He left. He was, I think, careful and clever and had prepared thoroughly. But the letter mentions that the farm may not be safe, and someone has been watching the Larkswood Road. She described the car on the verge. Constance Bellamy's observation, offered with full credit, and she described the quality of Patricia Thorne's behavior over the previous week. The direct question at the chemist's, the minimal shopping, the visible strain. In Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature, she said, and she used the formulation without self-consciousness, as a simple statement of credential. A person who has been asked to hold something difficult on behalf of another person, and who has agreed because they trusted or cared for that person, and who then finds themselves holding it alone, that person does not generally seek help. They have already committed themselves to a particular silence, and they maintain it because they believe the silence is protective of someone they care for. She looked at Sergeant Holt steadily. But the silence protects them very much less than it protects anyone else. Sergeant Holt had become very still. He had the expression, quite precisely, of a man who has just noticed something he ought to have noticed some days earlier, and who is sufficiently professional to accept this with grace and move on from it immediately. "Patricia Thorne," he said. "I think she may be keeping something from Mr. Farrant that someone else wants. I think whoever parked on the Larkswood verge is not there out of casual curiosity." Miss Marple lifted her basket and drew a fold of her coat across her lap. "I don't imagine for a moment that I'm telling you anything about Mr. Farrant's situation that your own inquiries won't uncover. And I have no knowledge of what the documents contain. I have only the letter's suggestion that they are consequential to someone who would prefer they not be produced." She stood. "But the farm is perhaps worth a visit, if you had occasion to pass that way." She thanked Sergeant Holt for the tea. Excellent. The water had been properly boiling, which made a difference people underestimated, and she thanked Constable Marsh for the notes he'd been taking, which she felt sure would prove useful. She left the station into a morning that was turning out finer than expected, the white overcast beginning to separate into proper clouds through which the September light was starting to come, and walked back along the high street toward home. Behind her, through the slightly open station window, she could hear, very faintly, the sound of Sergeant Holt's chair being pushed back from the desk, and then the purposeful sound of a telephone being lifted. Chapter 10. After the fair. September came in the way September comes in that part of England, politely, with one last warm week as a sort of going-away gift, before establishing itself properly with its shorter days and thicker light, and the first of the seasons with smoke drifting from cottage chimneys. The horse chestnuts along the boundary of the fair field began, just at the edges of their leaves, to turn, not autumn color yet, which required the cold proper, but a kind of preparatory yellowing, like a person beginning to put on their coat before the taxi arrives. The matter of Aldous Farrant had concluded in the way Miss Marple had expected it to conclude, which is to say, quietly, and mostly off the page of what any member of the public was officially aware of. Sergeant Holt had driven out to Larkswood Farm on Monday afternoon, in company with a colleague from the county station. Patricia Thorne had opened her door to them without, apparently, any expression of surprise. The expression of a woman who had been, for some time, expecting either this or something considerably less pleasant, and found this to be the better of the two. She had made tea. She had answered questions with the same directness with which she had asked them at the chemist's. And she had produced, from a location in the farmhouse that Sergeant Holt declined to specify when he later touched on the matter, a set of documents whose exact nature was passed upward to people in offices who were not in steeple worthy, and whose decisions about what was to be done with it were made at a level of authority that Constable Marsh found both reassuring and slightly frustrating. What was known in the village, in the slightly modified version that word travels with remarkable efficiency, had circulated within 4 days. Aldous Farrant had, before coming to Steeple Worthy 3 years ago, worked briefly for a firm in Ipswich that had not proved to be what it presented itself as. He had, in the course of this employment, come into possession of records that documented the nature of the discrepancy between what the firm presented itself as and what it was. He had kept these records, with the prudent caution of a man who understood they constituted both a risk and a protection. He had left Ipswich and established himself in Steeple Worthy, with a shop and a modest life and a habit of driving to the coast periodically to confirm that a certain arrangement held. When this arrangement had begun to fail, he had done what the letter instructed. He had been sensible, and had removed himself and what he knew to somewhere that was not Steeple Worthy, where the original firm could not efficiently find him. He was, as Miss Marple had suspected, quite well. The person who had parked on the Larkswood verge, a man from Ipswich, known to the relevant county authorities under a name that was not the one he had given to anyone in the village, had been, by Wednesday of that week, no longer in the area. The efficiency with which this had occurred suggested, to Miss Marple, that the documents Patricia Thorne had produced were considerably more consequential than even the letter's careful language had conveyed. It was on a Thursday, the kind of September Thursday that earns its place in memory without doing anything in particular to deserve it, simply by being mild and golden and completely itself, that Miss Marple walked out to Larkswood Farm. She did not telephone ahead. She arrived at 3:30, which is the time of day at a working farm when the morning's essential work is done and the evening's is not yet fully begun, and when a cup of tea is always welcome and always made. She found Patricia Thorne in the kitchen, which was a large room with a flagstone floor and a dresser the color of old cream and a window overlooking the barley field, which was cut now and calm. Patricia Thorne was 27. Miss Marple revised this from the vague, earlier impression. She was exactly 27, and she had the broad shoulders and the practical hands and the direct gaze that Constance Bellamy had described, and she also had, today for the first time in some weeks by the look of it, the aspect of a person who has slept. The strain was diminished, though not entirely absent. These things took time to leave the body, in Miss Marple's experience, even after they had left the situation. She put the kettle on without asking, which Miss Marple found exactly right. "I wanted to see how you were," said Miss Marple, sitting at the kitchen table, which had the surface of a table that had been used for 40 years of practical work and has not minded any of it. "I'm well," said Patricia Thorne. "Better." She said it in the direct way, meaning it. "You asked at the chemist's whether there was news of him," said Miss Marple, accepting her tea. "That was, I thought, rather brave." Patricia looked up, and Miss Marple saw in her expression something which was not quite surprise. More the thing that comes after surprise, when a person who did not know they needed to be understood discovers unexpectedly that they have been. I thought it was probably foolish, she said, asking like that, out loud. It showed you were more afraid for him than for yourself, said Miss Marple, which is not, when one comes to consider it honestly, a failing of any kind. They were quiet for a moment, in the way that two people can be quiet when the hardest part of a thing has been named and does not need to be circled. Outside, two of the farm's resident sparrows conducted a brief and energetic dispute in the gutter above the window, resolved it in the usual sparrow fashion, that is, entirely, and departed. He wrote, said Patricia Thorne, 2 days ago. Well, he didn't say where. He said he was safe. Of course he did, said Miss Marple warmly. He is that kind of young man. He would not leave someone in uncertainty if he could help it. He said he'd found work. Clocks, somewhere. He has the skill for it. She looked at her tea. He said he hopes to come back once clear. I expect he will, said Miss Marple, and said it with the quiet authority of someone who has considered the question thoroughly and means what she says. They stayed for another 30 minutes, speaking of other things, the barley yield, which had been good, the strawberries that would come again in June, the state of the south fence, which was being replaced with a proper post and rail. It was the conversation of an ordinary afternoon visit between two women of different ages who have found, without particularly arranging it, that they understand one another rather well. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Patricia Thorne accompanied her to the gate at the end of the yard, where the lane ran quiet in both directions. The sparrows were in the elder hedge now, a general cheerful congress of them, going about their business. Thank you, said Patricia Thorne. She did not specify for what, which was right. When a thing can be specified, it is usually smaller than the actual gratitude. Not at all, said Miss Marple, which is what one says in the English countryside when one means the opposite. She walked back along the Larkswood Lane in the particular September light, the late afternoon light that comes in low and amber and makes the hedgerows look as though they are lit from inside. Her basket was lighter on the way home than it had been on the way out, because she had left behind the second jar of marmalade, which Patricia Thorne had accepted with the genuine pleasure of a person who will put it to use. She walked at her customary pace, which is to say she walked slowly enough that nothing of the lane was missed, and quickly enough that the evening did not catch her before she reached her gate. The village, as she entered it from the Larkswood end, was in its early evening state. The light on the stone faces of the cottages, the bakery closed and its window dark, but still holding the ghost of its morning warmth, the post office shuttered, the privet at the police station trimmed to its civic intention. The bunting from the fair had been taken down, but the nail that Aldous Farrant had put in the corner of his building remained. His shop was still closed and dark, but it had the quality of a place that is waiting rather than empty. Word had traveled in its efficient village way. Not all of it, not the official or consequential parts, but enough. Enough that people had the sense of something having been navigated, of a particular difficulty having been met with quiet competence by the parties most concerned and resolved without drama, which is the preferred method in communities of long standing. Miss Marple turned in at her gate. The Michaelmas daisies along the south wall had opened, just at the tips, in her absence, the palest possible lilac, as though the color itself were trying the air before committing. The robin was on the gate-post, and considered her with the frank appraisal of a creature who recognizes a person who knows the garden's business without needing to be told. She stood for a moment in the early evening, with the village settling behind her and the garden opening before her, and she thought about nothing in particular, which is the particular privilege of a person who has thought about everything necessary and found, as she generally did, that the world, for all its complications, its concealments, its small and large failures of honesty, remained, in the end, legible. Then she went inside, put the kettle on, and drew the kitchen curtains against the first proper chill of autumn.